Why did a NASA scientist destroy 15 years of his career to hide a single video recording? What did his quantum camera capture inside an abandoned observatory that made him fall to his knees and weep? This story will shake everything you think you know about science and faith, about what exists beyond our dimension, and what watches us from the spaces between worlds. Listen until the very end, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see reality itself. The laboratory was silent except for the hum of machines. Dr. James Patterson stood alone before the monitors, his hands trembling as he reached for the delete button. On the screen, 17 seconds of footage glowed, footage that defied every law of physics he'd spent his life defending. A form made entirely of light, suspended in midair, its structure impossible, its movement defying gravity, space, and time itself. But that wasn't what terrified him. It was the sound the spectrograph had captured. A voice, if it could be called that, resonating at frequencies that shouldn't exist, speaking words in classical Arabic, repeating over and over, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. God is greatest. God is greatest. God is greatest. James's finger hovered over the delete button. 15 years of research. His reputation, his career. Everything would end if he deleted this, but everything would end if he didn't. Because some doors, once proven to exist, can never be closed again. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and leave a comment telling me which country you're watching from. Your engagement helps us share more stories that bridge science and faith. 6 months earlier, Dr. James Patterson was not a man who believed in anything he couldn't measure. At 42, he was one of NASA's leading quantum physicists, specializing in theoretical portals and dimensional rifts, not because he believed they existed, but because he was determined to prove they didn't. Portals are science fiction, he would tell his students at MIT. Dimensional gateways, wormholes stable enough for matter transfer, pure fantasy. The energy requirements alone would exceed anything we could generate. But we study them anyway because disproving impossibilities is how real science advances. His colleagues called him the debunker. His ex-wife called him emotionally closed. His 12-year-old daughter, Sarah, called him on Sundays from Boston, their conversations stilted and brief, filled with the awkward silences of a relationship held together by obligation rather than understanding. Dad, do you ever wonder if there's more to life than just particles and equations? Sarah had asked him last month. Wondering without evidence is just daydreaming, sweetheart, he'd replied, not noticing how her voice had dropped with disappointment. The project that would change everything began with a mockery. At a Cambridge conference on theoretical physics, Dr. Rashid Al-Mansouri, a Muslim physicist from Qatar, presented research on spiritual dimensions intersecting with quantum space. Respectfully, James had stood up during Q&A, his voice dripping with condescension. You're mixing metaphysics with physics. The Quran might mention dimensions beyond our perception, but that doesn't make them scientifically valid. Show me measurable proof, or admit this is just faith dressed in scientific language. The room had gone uncomfortably silent. Rashid, instead of getting defensive, had smiled calmly. Dr. Patterson, what if I told you I have coordinates? A location where quantum instability suggests a dimensional weak point. Come with proper equipment. Measure it. If you find nothing, I will publicly retract my research and acknowledge the supremacy of materialist science. James had laughed. You're offering me a chance to publicly debunk interdimensional mysticism. When do we leave? The Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter of Saudi Arabia, stretched endlessly in all directions, an ocean of sand under a sky so clear that stars seemed close enough to touch. The abandoned observatory sat atop a rocky outcrop, a forgotten relic from the 1970s, when Saudi Arabia had briefly invested in astronomical research before budget cuts shuttered the program. James stood outside the rusted metal door, his quantum detection equipment heavy on his back. Rashid Al-Mansouri was already inside, setting up instruments with the help of 2 graduate students. This building has a history, Rashid explained as James entered. In 1979, the research team here reported unusual readings, space-time distortions, electromagnetic anomalies. They attributed it to equipment malfunction and moved operations elsewhere. But the readings never stopped. Locals avoid this place. They say at certain times, especially during Fajr, the pre-dawn prayer, strange lights appear. Local superstition, James muttered. unpacking his quantum spectrograph. Probably just atmospheric phenomena, ball lightning maybe. Perhaps, Rashid said softly. Or perhaps there are thin places in our world, Dr. Patterson. Places where the veil between dimensions wears thin. The Quran speaks of beings made of smokeless fire, jinn, who exist in a dimension parallel to ours. What if quantum physics and spiritual truth are describing the same phenomena from different languages? James didn't bother responding. He was already calibrating his instruments, setting up the array that would monitor quantum fluctuations, electromagnetic fields, gravitational anomalies, every measurable parameter of reality. We'll run recordings for 72 hours, James announced. If anything unusual happens, we'll catch it. And when we catch nothing but normal background radiation, Dr. Al-Mansouri, you'll owe the scientific community an apology. Night fell. The desert cold seeped through the observatory walls. Rashid and his students excused themselves to pray Isha, the night prayer. James watched them with barely concealed disdain as they unrolled small rugs and faced Mecca, their foreheads touching the ground in prostration. Grown men talking to empty air, he muttered to himself, turning back to his monitors. But as the night deepened, something changed. The quantum spectrograph began registering fluctuations, minor at first, then increasingly pronounced. James frowned, running diagnostics. The equipment was functioning perfectly, yet the readings suggested impossible instabilities in local spacetime. At 3:47 a.m., 17 minutes before Fajr, every instrument went haywire simultaneously. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 30 seconds. James's breath came out in visible clouds, despite the desert location. Every hair on his arms stood on end, as a massive electromagnetic spike lit up his monitors like a Christmas tree. What the... James jumped to his feet, his heart hammering. The air in the center of the observatory began to shimmer, like heat waves in reverse. The quantum camera, set to capture particles invisible to human eyes, began recording automatically, its sensors triggered by off-the-chart anomalies. Rashid burst through the door, his prayer rug still in hand. "It's happening," he whispered. "Just like the old report said, during Fajr." "It's just some kind of atmospheric disturbance," James insisted, but his voice lacked conviction, because what his instruments were showing couldn't be atmospheric. The readings indicated a localized distortion in space itself, as if reality was bending inward at a single point. And then they saw it. At first it was just a pinpoint of light, impossibly bright, yet not painful to look at. Then it expanded, unfolding like origami in reverse, taking on a shape that human geometry couldn't quite accommodate. It wasn't a sphere, wasn't a cube. It was something that existed in more dimensions than three, and viewing it felt like looking at a 3D object's shadow cast on a 2D surface, except in reverse. The form, and James couldn't think of a better word for it, hovered 3 feet off the ground. It seemed to be made of pure light, but light that had substance, that moved with intention. Geometric patterns swirled within it, patterns that James's mind kept trying and failing to fully process. "Oh my God," James breathed. The form rotated slowly, and as it did, James's audio spectrograph began picking up sound, except it wasn't sound, not exactly. It was vibration at the quantum level, resonating through the very fabric of space. His equipment translated it into audible frequencies, and through the laboratory speakers came a voice, deep, resonant, speaking in a language James didn't understand, but that Rashid clearly did. The Muslim scientist's face had gone pale, his eyes wide with awe and terror. "What is it saying?" James demanded. Rashid's voice shook. It's reciting Ayat al-Kursi, the throne verse from the Quran, the verse we recite for protection against evil, against the unseen. But it's not just reciting, it's saying it like a testimony, like a declaration. The form pulsed brighter with each word, its geometric patterns becoming more complex, more beautiful, more impossible. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it began to contract, folding back in on itself, dimensions collapsing, until there was nothing left at a pinpoint. That pinpoint hung in the air for 3 more seconds. Then it vanished. The temperature normalized, the instruments calmed, and James stood in the sudden silence, staring at the space. "Impossible." "Tell me," she'd said quietly. James looked down at his quantum. The red recording light was still on. 17 seconds of footage. 17 seconds that would either make him the most celebrated scientist in history or destroy his career entirely. "I need to analyze this," James said, his voice hollow. There has to be an explanation." But even as he said it, he knew. He'd seen too much, measured too much. Whatever that entity was, it existed. It was real, and it was praying. James didn't sleep for 3 days. Back in his MIT laboratory, he ran every test he could conceive on the 17 seconds of footage. He checked for equipment malfunction, digital tampering, atmospheric interference, quantum tunneling effects, ball lightning, plasma phenomena, every possible rational explanation. They all came back negative. The entity on the recording was real. It existed in measurable space, distorted gravitational and electromagnetic fields, and emitted coherent vibrations that translated into spoken Arabic, classical Arabic, according to Rashid, who James had been calling obsessively despite their time zone difference. "The pronunciation is perfect," Rashid told him during one 2 a.m. video call. "Better than perfect. It's ancient, the way the Quran would have been recited in the 7th century. Dr. Patterson, what you've captured, this is a jinn, a being from the dimension of the unseen, manifesting briefly in our world. There has to be another explanation," James insisted, though his conviction was crumbling. "Beings from other dimensions don't pray. They don't recite religious texts." "Why not?" Rashid challenged. "The Quran tells us that jinn are created beings like humans with free will. Some are believers, some are not. Some worship Allah, some reject faith. What you recorded might be a righteous jinn, one of the believers, performing dhikr, remembrance of God." James hung up and stared at the frozen frame on his screen, the luminous form at its most expanded, its geometric patterns at their most complex. And for the first time in his scientific career, he felt an emotion he'd never associated with research: fear. He didn't release the findings, didn't write a paper, didn't tell NASA. Instead, he did something he'd never done before. He went back. The empty quarter welcomed him with the same indifferent vastness. The observatory looked more desolate in daylight, its rust and decay more pronounced. But James's equipment was more sophisticated this time. He'd brought quantum entanglement sensors, gravitational wave detectors, even an experimental device designed to measure exotic particles that theoretically shouldn't exist. He set everything up and waited. Fajr came at 4:23 a.m. At 4:06, the instruments began their now familiar spike. At 4:09, the temperature plummeted. At 4:11, the entity appeared. But this time it wasn't alone. 3 forms manifested. 3 distinct entities, each composed of that same impossible light, each rotating through dimensions human eyes couldn't fully comprehend. They hovered in a triangular formation, and the quantum audio captured their voices, all 3 reciting different verses, a harmony of Arabic prayer that sent chills down James's spine. One recited Ayat al-Kursi again, another recited from Surah al-Fatiha, the opening chapter. The third recited something Rashid would later identify as al-Mu'awwidhatain, the 2 chapters of protection. They stayed for 42 seconds this time, long enough for James' equipment to map them extensively, long enough for him to realize that they were aware of him. One of the entities turned, rotated its impossible geometry until it seemed to be facing him directly. James felt something then, a presence, an intelligence vast and alien studying him with the same intensity he was studying it. And in that moment of mutual observation, James understood with horrible clarity. They knew what he was doing. They knew he was recording them, and they didn't care. Or perhaps terrifyingly, they wanted to be recorded. The entities vanished at 4:13 a.m., exactly when Fajr began in the nearest city. James became obsessed. MIT granted him a sabbatical when his performance began slipping, his lectures incoherent, his research proposals increasingly bizarre. His daughter Sarah called less frequently, her voice edged with worry. "Dad, Mom says you sound crazy. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart, better than fine. I'm onto something revolutionary." But he wasn't fine. He was unraveling. Because the more he studied the recordings, the more questions emerged, and none of the answers fit inside the materialist worldview he'd built his entire career upon. He contacted physicists who specialized in string theory, in M theory, in quantum loop gravity, anyone who might have theoretical frameworks for parallel dimensions. Most dismissed his findings as fraud. A few expressed cautious interest. One, Dr. Helen Morrison from CERN, told him bluntly, "James, if this is real, you're looking at evidence of the multiverse. But the multiverse doesn't pray. What you're showing me suggests conscious entities existing in higher dimensions. That's not physics. That's theology." In desperation, James did something that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. He began studying Islam. He bought a translation of the Quran, started attending lectures at the Cambridge Mosque, sitting in the back, a notebook in hand. He interviewed imams, Islamic scholars, anyone who might help him understand what he'd witnessed. The jinn are mentioned in the Quran extensively, Imam Yusuf explained patiently during one session. They are beings created from smokeless fire, given free will just as humans are. Some are Muslims. They believe in Allah and follow His guidance. Others are kafir. They reject faith. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, actually led prayers where both humans and believing jinn attended. But why would they manifest in our dimension? James pressed. What's the purpose? The Imam smiled gently. Brother James, perhaps the better question is, why do you assume you're in your dimension and they're visiting from theirs? What if we share existence, just at different frequencies? What if they've always been there, and you've simply developed tools sophisticated enough to finally detect them? The thought was staggering. James returned to MIT and reanalyzed every quantum anomaly NASA had ever recorded. He found patterns, subtle, easily dismissed distortions in spacetime that occurred with statistical improbability near mosques during prayer times, near Mecca, near places of worship. He found a 1977 Soviet paper, suppressed during the Cold War, describing quantum entities observed during Ramadan near a mosque in Uzbekistan. He found a Chinese study from 2003 noting gravitational anomalies in Xinjiang that correlated with Islamic prayer times, research that had been buried when the Chinese government began its campaign against Uyghur Muslims. The evidence was there, scattered, dismissed, ridiculed, but there. And then James made his critical mistake. He sent his findings to Dr. Richard Kepler, the head of NASA's Exotic Physics Division and James's former mentor. Kepler's response came within 24 hours. It wasn't what James expected. Come to Houston immediately. Bring all original recordings. Do not upload anything to any server. Do not share with anyone else. This is beyond classification. This is world-changing. We need to contain this properly. James boarded the flight to Houston with a knot in his stomach, because Kepler's message hadn't sounded excited. It had sounded afraid. The NASA facility in Houston looked the same as always. Sterile corridors, security checkpoints, the low hum of advanced technology. But the conference room Kepler led him to was different. It was a SCIF, a sensitive, compartmented information facility, shielded from all electronic surveillance. Inside waited 5 people James didn't recognize, military by the bearing, intelligence agencies by the cold assessment in their eyes. Dr. Patterson, Kepler began, his voice tight, what I'm about to tell you is classified at levels beyond top secret. You will sign documents agreeing never to speak of this to anyone, under penalty of imprisonment. Do you understand? James felt ice in his veins. What's going on, Richard? Sit down, James. For the next 2 hours they briefed him, and with each revelation, James's understanding of reality cracked further. The United States government had known about interdimensional entities since 1952. Project Blue Book hadn't just been about UFOs. It had been about these entities, these forms of light that appeared during specific religious observances. Not just Islamic ones, but Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist. Every major faith had reported them, though they manifested differently according to cultural context. We call them IDEs, interdimensional entities, explained Colonel Harrison, a stern woman with 3 decades in military intelligence. Your recordings are the clearest evidence we've ever captured, Dr. Patterson, but they're not unique. Every major government has some knowledge of this phenomenon. We've been suppressing it for 70 years. Suppressing it. James felt sick. Why? Because, Kepler said quietly, what happens when you tell the world that science has confirmed the existence of beings described in religious texts? You don't get a peaceful integration of faith and science. You get chaos, fundamentalism on one side claiming vindication, atheist movements collapsing, governments losing control as people abandon material concerns for spiritual ones. It would destabilize everything. James looked at the faces around the table. You've known that there's a spiritual dimension to reality, that there are beings that pray, that worship. You've known this for decades and you've hidden it. For the greater good, Harrison said flatly. The public isn't ready. So what do you want from me? James demanded. Kepler slid a document across the table. We want you to join a special research division. Study these entities properly, with unlimited resources, without the constraints of peer review or public scrutiny. Help us understand them. Not to communicate, not to engage, but to predict and potentially control their manifestations. James stared at the document, at the salary figure, 3 times his current income, at the resources, equipment that made his current tools look like children's toys, at the prison sentence that would result if he refused and spoke publicly. "And if I don't sign? Then you'll be detained under the National Security Act," Harrison said matter-of-factly. "Your recordings will be confiscated, your research discredited, and you'll spend the rest of your career, if not your life, being monitored to ensure your silence." James looked at each face around the table. None showed sympathy. These were people who had long ago chosen pragmatism over truth. "Can I have 24 hours to think about it?" he asked quietly. Kepler glanced at Harrison, who nodded curtly. 24 hours. But you'll remain in a secured facility during that time. No outside contact. They escorted James to a small apartment within the compound, comfortable but isolated, a gilded cage. And in that cage, alone with his thoughts, James finally understood what Rashid had tried to tell him 6 months ago. Some truths are too dangerous for those who profit from lies. The phone in the apartment rang at 9 p.m. James stared at it, confused. He wasn't supposed to have outside contact, but when he answered, his daughter's voice came through, small and frightened. "Dad, they said I could call you just for 5 minutes." "Sarah?" James's heart clenched. "Sweetheart, how did you—" "Mom said you're at some NASA thing in Houston. Dad, are you in trouble? She's really worried. I'm really worried. You haven't been yourself for months." James sat down heavily. In his obsession with the recordings, with the entities, with proving the impossible, when had he last really talked to his daughter? When had he last been present for her? "I'm okay, honey. I've discovered something important, something that might change how we understand the universe." "Dad, you always say stuff like that, but you never talk about anything real. You never ask about my life, about school, about—" Her voice cracked. "About how scared I was when you and Mom divorced, about how lonely it is being the kid whose dad is so smart he can't relate to normal people." Each word was a knife. James had spent his whole career measuring the universe, but had never measured the distance he'd created between himself and his child. "Sarah, they told me I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to say this. Whatever you discovered, whatever you're working on, is it worth it? Is proving you're right more important than being a dad?" Silence stretched between them. In his mind, James saw 2 futures. In one, he signed the papers, joined the secret division, spent the rest of his life studying interdimensional entities behind locked doors, contributing to a cover-up that benefited only those who feared change. He'd be comfortable, secure, and completely complicit in hiding truth from humanity. In the other future, he refused. He'd be discredited, possibly imprisoned, definitely destroyed professionally. But he'd be free. And maybe, just maybe, he could be the father Sarah deserved. "Sarah," he said slowly, "do you believe in God?" "What? Dad, that's a weird question. Just answer it. Please." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I think so. Mom takes me to church sometimes at Christmas and Easter." "Why?" "Because I think I've been wrong about something important. I've spent my whole life believing that only what we can measure is real, that faith was weakness, that mystery was just ignorance waiting to be solved. But I've seen something, Sarah. I've seen evidence that there's more to existence than atoms and equations. And I have to decide whether to hide that truth or share it, even if sharing it costs me everything." "Dad, you're scaring me." "Don't be scared, sweetheart. I'm actually less scared than I've been in years, because I think I finally understand what matters. Listen, when I get out of here, can we spend a weekend together? Just us. No work, no equations. Just a dad and his daughter." He could hear tears in her voice. "Really, really, I promise. I love you, Dad. I love you too, Sarah, more than I've ever been able to show you." The call ended. James sat in the silence, staring at the contract on the coffee table. Then he picked up a pen and wrote across it in large letters, "I refuse truth matters more than comfort." They came for him at dawn, security personnel, grim-faced and efficient. But James was already dressed, the contract with his refusal prominently displayed on the table. Colonel Harrison read his message without expression. "You understand what this means, Dr. Patterson? I understand perfectly. You'll lose everything, your reputation, your career, possibly your freedom." "I've already lost what matters most," James said quietly. "My integrity, my relationship with my daughter, my sense of wonder. I'm not losing anything else." Kepler looked genuinely pained. "James, please, think about this rationally. I have been thinking rationally, Richard. That's the problem. What you're asking me to do isn't science, it's suppression. Real science seeks truth and shares it, no matter the consequences. Harrison made a gesture, and 2 security guards stepped forward. Dr. James Patterson, you're being detained under the National Security Act pending... The lights went out. Not just in the room, in the entire facility. Emergency systems should have kicked in immediately, but they didn't. The darkness was absolute, and in that darkness James felt the temperature plummet. What the... Harrison's voice, sharp with alarm. Then the light began. Not from emergency generators, but from the center of the room. That same impossible geometry, that same luminous presence, except now it was manifesting inside a maximum security government facility. The entity was larger this time, more complex. And it wasn't alone. Dozens of forms materialized around it, filling the room with their otherworldly radiance. The audio spectrograph James still wore on his belt, they hadn't confiscated his personal equipment yet, began recording automatically. The entities spoke in unison, their voices resonating through dimensions human ears couldn't fully process. But the translation was clear, echoing through the room. Kul huwa Allahu ahad, Allahus samad, lam yalid walam yulad, walam yakun lahu kufuwan ahad. It was Surah Al-Ikhlas, the chapter of absolute monotheism. Say, He is Allah the One, Allah the eternal refuge. He neither begets nor is born, nor is there to him any equivalent. Kepler had fallen to his knees, his face pale with terror or awe. James couldn't tell which. Harrison was shouting into her radio, but it was dead, no response. The security guards had backed against the walls, their weapons uselessly pointed at beings that existed partially outside of space-time. One entity moved toward James. It stopped directly in front of him, its geometric patterns shifting, and James realized with strange clarity it was studying him the same way he'd studied them. 2 forms of intelligence meeting across the dimensional divide. Then it spoke. Not in Arabic this time, but in English, though the voice still carried that impossible resonant quality. We have been patient, Dr. James Patterson. We have allowed ourselves to be observed, recorded, studied. Do you understand why? James found his voice. No. Because truth seeks truth. You pursued us with honesty, even when it challenged everything you believed. Others, the entity rotated toward Harrison and Kepler. They pursue us with fear and desire for control. They would cage truth as they cage us in their understanding. What do you want? James whispered. We want what we have always wanted. To worship in peace, to exist as Allah created us. We want your species to stop pretending you are alone in creation. We want the veil to thin properly with understanding rather than fear. The entity pulsed brighter. You have been given a choice, James Patterson. Choose truth and face consequences. Choose silence and face comfortable emptiness. Both paths are valid. Both are your free will, but know this. We see both futures. In one you become a voice crying in the wilderness, dismissed and ridiculed, but free. In the other, you become a well-fed prisoner. Choose. The lights returned. The entities vanished. But James's spectrograph showed 147 seconds of recording, the clearest, most detailed evidence yet of interdimensional consciousness. Harrison recovered first, her military training overriding her shock. Seize that equipment. No recordings leave this facility. But James had already uploaded it. Before coming to Houston, he'd set up dead man switches, cloud backups that would release automatically if he didn't check in. The upload had started the moment the entities appeared, transmitted over quantum-encrypted channels that government jammers couldn't touch. Too late, James said quietly. It's already out there. Multiple servers, multiple countries. In 12 hours it'll automatically post to every major scientific journal, news outlet and social media platform on Earth. Kepler stared at him in horror. James, what have you done? What I should have done months ago. I've set the truth free. The recordings went viral within 6 hours. By morning, they'd been viewed 300 million times. By afternoon, they were the only story the world was discussing. Scientists scrambled to verify authenticity. Intelligence agencies issued denials. Religious leaders offered interpretations. The internet exploded with theories, debates, panic, wonder, and everything in between. James, now officially a fugitive from government detention, gave a single video statement from a safe house arranged by Rashid al-Mansouri. I am Dr. James Patterson. I have spent my career trying to disprove the existence of anything beyond material reality. I was wrong. The recordings you've seen are authentic. They show conscious, intelligent beings from dimensions parallel to ours, beings that worship, that pray, that believe in God. I don't ask you to accept my interpretation. I ask you to look at the evidence and think for yourselves. Truth doesn't need protection. It needs courage. The backlash was immediate and savage. NASA issued a statement disavowing him. MIT revoked his tenure. Mainstream scientific journals called it an elaborate hoax despite no evidence of tampering. But independent verification began trickling in from labs worldwide. The recordings were genuine, the quantum signatures authentic, the phenomenon real. Religious communities had more complex reactions. Some imams celebrated it as validation of Islamic teachings about jinn. Some Christian pastors called it demonic deception. Hindu scholars noted similarities to descriptions of devas. Jewish rabbis debated its implications for understanding the Or Ein Sof, the divine light. The government came for James as he'd known they would. Federal charges, espionage, violation of the National Security Act, releasing classified information. He faced decades in prison. But something unexpected happened. Public opinion shifted. Rallies formed demanding transparency. Scientists who'd been intimidated into silence began coming forward with their own suppressed findings. A UN emergency session was called to discuss the IDE phenomenon. Though consensus was impossible when worldviews were collapsing, James's trial became a circus. The prosecution argued national security. The defense argued public interest. But the real drama came when character witnesses took the stand. Rashid al-Mansouri testified about James's transformation from dismissive skeptic to honest seeker of truth. Fellow scientists spoke about the importance of following evidence wherever it leads. And then, in the moment that broke the courtroom into tears, a small voice from the gallery called out, "That's my dad. He's a hero." Sarah had come, against her mother's wishes, against the advice of lawyers. The 12-year-old girl sat in the front row of a federal courtroom and declared her father innocent. The judge called a recess. James was allowed 5 minutes with his daughter, supervised by marshals. "You came," he whispered, hugging her tight. "You kept your promise, Dad. You chose truth. You chose to be brave." She looked up at him and he saw tears streaming down her face. "Mom said you were crazy, that you threw your life away. But I watched your statement. I understand now. You're showing people that it's okay to change your mind when you find better evidence. That's what real scientists do." In that moment, James knew, whatever happened next, whatever price he paid, he'd already won the only victory that mattered. His daughter understood. She saw him, and she was proud. James Patterson served 18 months in a minimum security federal facility. His sentence was reduced due to public pressure and the inability of prosecutors to prove actual harm to national security. During his incarceration, the world continued its upheaval. The scientific community split into 3 factions: those who accepted the IDE phenomenon and sought to understand it, those who rejected it as mass delusion despite evidence, and those who waited for more data before committing. NASA, CERN, and other major institutions began open IDE research programs, their previous secret programs exposed by whistleblowers, emboldened by James's example. Religious communities underwent their own transformations. Interfaith dialogue exploded as leaders tried to reconcile different traditions' understanding of interdimensional beings. Some fundamentalists insisted the entities were demons, regardless of what they said. Progressive clergy saw opportunities for deeper theological understanding. Mystical traditions, Sufism in Islam, Kabbalah in Judaism, contemplative orders in Christianity, suddenly found their experiential knowledge valued by scientists seeking to understand consciousness across dimensions. When James was released, he didn't return to MIT. He couldn't. His academic career was destroyed. Instead, he did something he'd never imagined. He opened a small research institute in Boston, funded by crowdfunding and private donors who believed in transparent science. The Patterson Institute for Interdimensional Studies was modest, just 3 rooms and a handful of researchers. But it was honest. Sarah visited every weekend. Now 13, she'd developed her own fascination with the work, not just the science, but the philosophy. "Dad, if these beings are real and they pray, what does that mean about God? Is religion right? Is atheism wrong?" "I don't think it's that simple, honey," James would tell her, sitting in his cluttered office. "The entities don't prove any particular religion is completely right or wrong. They prove that consciousness exists beyond our dimension, that there's more to reality than matter. What we do with that knowledge, that's still up to us. The recordings themselves became cultural touchstones. Artists created works inspired by the geometric entities. Musicians composed pieces trying to capture their impossible harmonies. Philosophers debated the implications for free will, consciousness, and the nature of divinity. But the most profound change was quieter, more personal. People reported renewed interest in spiritual practices, not necessarily organized religion, but meditation, prayer, contemplation. The recordings had done something no preacher could. They'd made the invisible undeniably visible, if only for 147 seconds. James testified before a UN scientific committee on IDE research standards. He consulted on quantum detection methods. He gave lectures to packed halls of students hungry for his story. And slowly, carefully, he rebuilt his life around a new purpose, not proving or disproving the invisible, but helping humanity learn to coexist with it. 2 years after the first recording, James stood in the empty quarter again. The Saudi government, under international pressure to allow supervised research, had granted permits. A dozen scientists from various countries set up equipment in the old observatory. Fajr came at 4:17 a.m. The entities appeared at 4:01. 17 forms this time, a constellation of impossible light, reciting verses of the Quran in harmony. James's equipment captured every detail, data shared in real time with researchers worldwide. No secrets, no classification, just pure, open science. And when one entity rotated to face him directly, James didn't feel fear. He felt something else: gratitude. These beings, by allowing themselves to be known, had freed him from the prison of certainty. They'd shown him that wonder and rigor could coexist, that mystery wasn't ignorance but invitation. "Thank you," he whispered. He didn't know if they could understand English, didn't know if they cared, but he needed to say it. The entity pulsed once, bright as a star, then vanished with the others as dawn broke over the desert. 3 years have passed since Dr. James Patterson recorded the first interdimensional entity. The world hasn't unified in belief. Human nature doesn't work that way. But something has shifted, subtle but profound. The walls between sacred and scientific have begun to dissolve. James is 45 now. His hair is graying, his career redefined, his life utterly transformed. He'll never work for NASA again, never publish in Nature or Science. But his small institute thrives, attracting young researchers who care more about truth than prestige. Sarah is 16, brilliant and questioning, planning to study both physics and comparative religion in college. "I want to understand how they work and what they mean," she tells him. "Is that weird?" "It's perfect," he assures her. The entities continue to manifest, not just in the empty quarter, but in locations worldwide that share certain quantum characteristics. Researchers have identified 247 thin places where interdimensional contact is most likely. Protocols exist now for observation, for respect, for coexistence. But James knows something most researchers haven't fully grasped yet. The entities didn't need to be proven. They existed whether humans believed or not, just as they always had. What changed wasn't their reality. It was human willingness to acknowledge it. "What do you think they want from us?" a young researcher asked James last week. "I don't think they want anything from us," James replied. "I think they want us to understand something about ourselves, that we're not alone, not the center of creation, not the measure of all reality. And maybe, just maybe, they want us to be humble enough to admit when we're wrong and brave enough to change." That night, James video called Rashid al-Mansouri, who'd become a close friend. They discussed the latest findings, debated interpretations, laughed about how impossible their friendship would have seemed 3 years ago. "James," Rashid said before ending the call, "do you pray now?" James was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if what I do counts as prayer, but I sit in silence sometimes, and I acknowledge that I'm surrounded by mysteries I'll never fully understand. And I try to be grateful for that. Is that prayer?" Rashid smiled. "The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that even a smile is charity. I think gratitude for mystery is definitely prayer. It might be the purest kind." After the call, James walked to his office window and looked up at the stars. Somewhere in those vast distances, other dimensions intersected with this one. Beings of light moved through spaces his mind couldn't fully comprehend, and in his small, finite way he was honored to witness it. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Love you, Dad. Proud of who you've become." James smiled, tears in his eyes. He'd spent 40 years measuring the universe and had missed the only measurement that mattered, the distance between who he was and who he could be. The entities had shown him that distance, and in crossing it, he'd found something more valuable than any scientific discovery. He'd found himself. If this story touched your heart, share it with those who need to remember that truth is worth any price. Leave a comment telling me, what would you do if faced with evidence that challenged everything you believed? Would you have the courage to choose truth over comfort? Subscribe to this channel for more stories that bridge the visible and invisible, the scientific and sacred, the known and the mysterious. Because in a world of easy answers, the most important questions remain. What is real? What is true? And what price are we willing to pay to find out? Assalamu alaikum. May peace be upon you all, and may you always have the courage to see clearly, even when the truth is impossible.